There's something deeply heartbreaking about watching someone who once had everything reduced to nothing but cold biscuits and fading memories. In a forgotten corner of Wyoming, a widow sits alone in her drafty cabin, her hands trembling from hunger and the bitter cold seeping through every crack in the walls. Her husband is gone. Her neighbors have stopped calling. The world has forgotten her, or so she thinks. But tonight, an old cowboy and his stubborn donkey are about to prove that some debts of the heart are never forgotten, and redemption can arrive when you least expect it. What could make a weathered stranger ride through a blizzard to save a woman he hasn't seen in 20 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat hunched against the Wyoming wind like an old man bracing for another blow. Clara Wynne moved slowly through the single room that had become her entire world, her worn slippers whispering across floorboards that groaned with age and neglect. Outside, February pressed against the windows with insistent fingers of frost. Painting intricate patterns she no longer bothered to admire. She was 64 years old, though lately she felt closer to 100. The cold had a way of settling into your bones when you didn't have enough food to fuel the fire inside. 2 winters had passed since Thomas died, and each season had stripped away another layer of the life they'd built together. First went the cattle, sold off to pay debts she hadn't known existed. Then the good furniture, the quilts her grandmother made, the silver service that had been a wedding gift. Now all that remained were the essentials and a few stubborn memories she couldn't quite let go. The wedding photograph still sat on the mantel in its silver frame, one of the last valuable things she owned. She dusted it every morning, a ritual that anchored her to better days. Thomas smiled out at her from 30 years ago, young and strong and so certain about their future. They'd bought this land with hope in their pockets and dreams bigger than the Montana sky. Built the cabin themselves, log by log, her holding the timbers while he notched and fitted them into place. "We'll raise our children here," he'd said. Standing in the doorway that first night, the smell of fresh-cut pine still heavy in the air. Fill this place with noise and laughter, but the children never came, no matter how they prayed or hoped or tried. Instead, they'd filled the silence with hard work and quiet contentment, building something else, a partnership, a life measured in shared sunrises and the simple pleasure of sitting together after a long day's work. Clara moved to the kitchen corner, such as it was. The wood stove hunched in its place, cold now. She'd stopped lighting it during the day, saving what little wood remained for the nights when the temperature dropped so low she could see her breath inside. On the shelf above the dry sink, 3 jars held the last of her supplies. Flour, enough for maybe 2 more batches of biscuits if she stretched it thin. A handful of dried beans, some cornmeal that had seen better days. The neighbors had helped at first after Thomas passed. Brought casseroles and bread, offered words of comfort that felt like smooth stones. Pretty but useless when you're drowning. Martha Henderson had been particularly kind, stopping by every few weeks with eggs or butter. But then Martha's husband took sick and her visits stopped. The Carlsons moved away that first summer. The Pritchards had their own troubles, 3 kids to feed and a ranch barely holding on. Slowly, the visits dried up like the creek bed in August. People had their own problems. Times were hard all over, and Clara, proud Clara, couldn't bring herself to ask for help. She'd been raised to stand on her own 2 feet, to weather storms without complaint. Thomas had loved that about her, her stubborn independence, her refusal to bend even when the wind howled. But pride doesn't keep you warm, and it doesn't fill your belly. She measured out flour with careful hands, adding water from the bucket she'd filled that morning, breaking the skin of ice that formed overnight. Her movements were practiced, economical. Every gesture counted when your supplies could be measured in days rather than weeks. The dough came together slowly, reluctant in the cold. She shaped it into small biscuits, placed them in the Dutch oven, and set it on the stove without lighting the fire. They'd be hard and dense, but they'd be food. While the biscuits sat uncooked, Clara walked to the window. Snow had been falling since dawn, adding to the 3 feet already blanketing the ground. The road, such as it was, had disappeared weeks ago. Even if she wanted to leave, wanted to walk the 8 miles to town and throw herself on someone's mercy, the journey would kill her. She was too weak now, her body consuming itself for want of proper nourishment. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 30 years working this land, helping Thomas build a life, and now the land itself seemed determined to reclaim her, return her to the earth that had given them so little despite their best efforts. She thought about Thomas often these days, how he'd worked himself to exhaustion trying to make the ranch profitable, how the years of drought had beaten him down, and then the wet year that brought disease to the herd, how he'd aged a decade in those final 2 years, the weight of failure pressing on his shoulders like a physical burden. "I'm sorry. Clara," he'd said near the end, lying in their bed, his breathing shallow and labored. "I promised you a good life. You gave me a good life," she'd told him, holding his hand, feeling how thin it had become. Every day with you was a good day. It had been true then, and it was true now. But truth didn't keep the cold at bay. She moved back to the stove and, despite her rationing instincts, built a small fire. The biscuits needed to cook, and she needed something warm in her belly. The wood caught slowly, and she coaxed it along with patience born of necessity. While she waited, she sat in Thomas's chair, her chair now, and pulled the quilt around her shoulders. Her grandmother's quilt, the pattern called wedding ring, the stitches so fine and even they looked like prayers sewn into fabric. The firelight flickered across the cabin walls, throwing shadows that danced and swayed. She'd read somewhere that starving people saw visions, their minds creating what the body craved. Sometimes she thought she saw Thomas moving in those shadows, just out of direct sight, always at the edge of her vision. "I'm tired," she said aloud to the empty room, to the shadows, to whatever might be listening. "I fought as long as I could." The biscuits finished cooking as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. She ate too slowly, savoring each bite, washing them down with water from her cup. They were like eating paste, but they were warm, and warmth was its own kind of blessing. Evening settled over the cabin like a blanket, bringing with it the special kind of silence that exists only in deep winter, in isolated places where the world seems to hold its breath. Clara lit the candle, one of her last 3, and opened her Bible, not to read, really. She'd read it so many times, she had whole passages memorized. But the weight of it in her hands was comforting, and pressed between the pages was a wildflower, dried and delicate. From her first spring with Thomas, she touched it gently, remembering the day he'd picked it for her. They'd been working on the fence line, hot sun beating down, both of them exhausted. He'd stopped suddenly, bent down, and plucked the small blue flower from beside a fence post. "For my beautiful wife," he'd said, presenting it with mock formality that made her laugh. She'd kept it all these years, moving it from book to book, a small piece of joy preserved in the pages of Scripture. Now it was brittle, would crumble to dust if she wasn't careful, but it was still here. Still evidence that happiness had existed in this place. Clara closed the Bible and set it aside. The cabin was dark now except for the single candle flame, and she was too tired to do anything but sit and wait for sleep. Her eyes drifted to the wedding photograph, Thomas's face smiling at her across the years. "I'll see you soon," she whispered. "Won't be long now." She closed her eyes and began to pray, not for rescue. She'd stopped praying for that weeks ago, but for peace, for a gentle passing, for an end to the cold and the hunger and the terrible, crushing loneliness that had become her constant companion. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, finding every gap and crack in the cabin's defenses. She pulled the quilt tighter and waited for sleep to come, for this day to end like all the others, with darkness and cold and the slow, steady erosion of hope. She didn't hear the footsteps on the porch, didn't hear the creak of the bottom step or the sound of boots on weathered boards. The knock, when it came, was so unexpected that at first she thought she'd imagined it. Then it came again, firm, definite, real. Clara's eyes opened. Her heart, which had been beating its slow, tired rhythm, suddenly surged with something like fear, something like hope. No one came out here anymore. No one even knew if she was still alive. The door opened before she could stand, before she could call out or prepare herself. Cold air rushed in like an invading army, and silhouetted against the darkness stood a man, tall and weathered, with snow dusting his shoulders and a hat pulled low against the wind. Behind him, just visible in the dim light, stood a donkey. The man stepped inside, his boots heavy on the floor, and pushed back his hat. His face was deeply lined, marked by decades of sun and wind and hard living. His eyes were kind, and in them Clara saw something she recognized: sorrow, loss, understanding. "Clara Wynne," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "Get your things. You're coming with me." She stared at him, her mind struggling to process what was happening. This had to be a dream, a vision brought on by hunger and exhaustion. Men didn't appear out of blizzards with donkeys and cryptic commands. "Who?" She started, but her voice cracked from disuse. "Hank Mercer," he said. "Don't expect you to remember me. It's been 20 years, give or take. 20 years. Clara's mind raced backward, sifting through memories. Hank Mercer. The name was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Couldn't attach it to a face or a moment. He must have seen her confusion, because he stepped closer, pulled off his gloves and held out his hands, large, calloused, marked with old scars. Winter of '05. I was doing survey work up in the high country. Got caught in a storm, wandered 3 days trying to find my way down. Half frozen, half starved, completely lost. You found me collapsed in your barn." The memory came back in a rush. Yes, the man in the barn, more ice than flesh, his lips blue and his eyes rolling back in his head. She'd dragged him into the house. Thomas was away in town, and she'd spent 2 days nursing him back to life with hot broth and blankets and sheer stubborn determination. "You saved my life," Hank said simply. "Now I'm returning the favor." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "That was nothing. Anyone would have—" "But you did," he interrupted. "And I don't forget my debts." He looked around the cabin, taking in the cold stove, the empty shelves, the desperate poverty that had become her life. His jaw tightened. "How long you been living like this?" "I'm managing," she said automatically, the pride rising up even now. "You're dying," he said bluntly. "Another week, maybe 2, and you'll be gone. I didn't ride 3 days through this weather to argue with you, Clara. I got a warm house, plenty of food, and a spare room. You're coming with me whether you like it or not." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need charity, didn't need saving. But the words wouldn't come, because he was right. She was dying, and some part of her, the part that wasn't quite ready to give up, wanted to live. "Why?" she whispered. "Why now?" Hank's expression softened. "Got word from Martha Henderson couple months back. Letter said you were in trouble, too proud to ask for help. I've been trying to get through ever since, but the weather's been hell. Finally got a break in the storms yesterday and rode straight through. Figured if I waited any longer I'd be too late. Martha." Dear Martha, who'd been too sick to visit but had still found a way to help. Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I can't pay you," she said. "Don't recall asking you to," Hank replied. "Now you got anything you need to bring? We got maybe an hour before the next storm hits, and I'd like to be moving." Clara looked around the cabin, at the life she'd built and lost, at the memories that clung to every surface. What did she need? What could she carry? Her eyes fell on the wedding photograph, on the Bible with its pressed flower, on Thomas's pocket watch, stopped at 3:47, the moment he'd drawn his last breath, and she'd forgotten to wind it, couldn't bear to wind it. Wanted time to stop right there with him. "Just a few things," she said. Her voice small. "Take what matters," Hank said. "Leave the rest." She moved through the cabin on unsteady legs, gathering what she couldn't leave behind. The photograph, wrapped carefully in a cloth. The Bible, the pocket watch. Her grandmother's quilt. A small bundle of Thomas's letters tied with ribbon. Her good dress, though it hung loose on her frame now. The few items felt impossibly heavy as she packed them into a canvas bag that had once held flour. Hank watched silently, then said, "That everything?" Clara nodded, casting one last look around the cabin. This place had been her home, her prison, her refuge, her hell. Leaving it felt like betrayal and relief in equal measure. "Then let's go," Hank said. He took the bag from her hands and slung it over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. "Storm's coming and Maud gets ornery when it's cold." "Maud?" "The donkey." He led her outside, where indeed a sturdy grey donkey stood waiting, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Stubborn as they come, but she'll get us through." Clara looked at the donkey, then at Hank, then back at the cabin one final time. The candle still burned in the window, a small point of light in the gathering darkness. She should blow it out, should close the door properly, should do 100 small things to secure the place. But Hank was right. The storm was coming, and if they didn't leave now, they might not leave at all. He helped her onto Maud's back, his hands gentle but firm. The donkey shifted but didn't protest. Clara settled herself as best she could, her body weak and unsteady. Hank handed her the reins, then took hold of Maud's halter. "We'll go slow," he said. 3 miles tonight, then we'll shelter. Rest of the way tomorrow if the weather holds." Clara opened her mouth to thank him, to say something that captured the enormity of what he was doing, but the words lodged in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, her hands clutching the reins and the saddle horn with equal desperation. Hank clicked his tongue, and Maud began to walk, plodding through the snow with the patience of a creature who'd done this many times before. Clara didn't look back. She couldn't. If she looked back, she might lose her nerve, might demand to return to that cold cabin and the slow death she'd been courting. The wind picked up as they moved away from the cabin, carrying snow that stung exposed skin and made visibility drop to almost nothing. Hank walked ahead, one hand on Maud's halter, his shoulders hunched against the weather. The donkey followed without complaint, her steps sure even in the deep snow. Clara had no sense of time or distance. The world contracted to the small circle of visibility around them, to the rhythm of Maud's swaying gait, to the cold that crept through her inadequate coat despite the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She focused on staying upright, on keeping her grip, on not sliding off into the snow and disappearing forever. At some point, minutes or hours later, she couldn't tell, Hank called out something she couldn't hear over the wind, but Maud responded, adjusting her path slightly. The terrain began to slope upward, and Clara felt her body tilt back to compensate. Then suddenly they were in the lee of something, a ridge, a rock formation, she couldn't tell, and the wind's fury decreased. Hank led them into what appeared to be a small cave or overhang, barely tall enough for the donkey to fit. "This'll do for tonight," Hank said, his voice hoarse from cold. "Get you out of the weather, get some food in you." He helped Clara down from Maud's back, and her legs nearly gave out when she tried to stand. He caught her easily, steadied her until she found her balance. The cave, if that's what it was tiny, but it was out of the wind, and that alone made it feel like paradise. Hank worked efficiently, unsaddling Maud and rubbing her down with a blanket he'd packed. The donkey stood patiently, occasionally turning her large head to watch what he was doing. Then he pulled out supplies Clara hadn't noticed before. A small portable stove, fuel, a pot, packages of food. "Sit," he told Clara, pointing to a spot against the back wall. "Rest." She obeyed because she had no strength left to do otherwise. Her body was shaking, part cold and part shock, and part the realization that she was actually here, actually leaving, actually being saved by a man she barely remembered. Hank got the stove going with practiced ease, melted snow in the pot, and added what looked like dried soup mix. The smell of cooking food made Clara's stomach cramp with hunger so intense it was almost painful. When had she last eaten a real meal? Weeks? Months? He stirred the pot, letting it heat through, then filled a cup and brought it to her. "Drink this slow," he said. "Your stomach's probably shrunk. Too much too fast and you'll be sick." The cup was warm in her hands, almost hot. She brought it to her lips and took a small sip. The broth was salty and rich and tasted like heaven. She wanted to gulp it down, wanted to drain the cup and demand more. But she heeded his warning and sipped slowly, letting each mouthful sit on her tongue before swallowing. Hank settled himself across from her, his back against the cave wall, his long legs stretched out. He filled his own cup and drank, his eyes on the cave entrance and the storm beyond. "How long since you ate proper?" he asked. "I eat?" Clara said defensively. "I saw your supplies. You've been starving yourself." She didn't answer. What could she say that wouldn't sound like an excuse or a plea for pity? "Martha's letter said your husband died couple years back," Hank continued. "Said the ranch failed, debts piled up. Said you've been alone out here, too proud to ask for help." "I didn't want to be a burden," Clara said quietly. "Burden," Hank snorted. "Woman saves my life, and she thinks accepting help makes her a burden." He shook his head. "World's got a strange sense of balance sometimes." That was different. "You were dying, so were you," he said bluntly. "Still are, if we're being honest. But we're gonna fix that." They sat in silence for a while, drinking the broth, listening to the wind howl outside. Maud had settled herself near the entrance, blocking some of the cold air, her large body a living wall. Clara finished her cup and Hank immediately refilled it, adding some kind of cracker or hardtack that she could soften in the liquid. "Your husband," Hank said after a while. "Thomas, wasn't it? He was a good man. I remember him from that winter. Came back from town and found a stranger in his house and didn't bat an eye. Just helped get me warm." Clara felt tears prick her eyes again. "He was the best man I ever knew. Then he'd want you to live," Hank said simply. "Not waste away in that cabin out of some misguided sense of loyalty. It's not about loyalty. It's—" She stopped, unsure how to explain. "That cabin was our life. Leaving it feels like leaving him." "He's not in that cabin," Hank said gently. "He's in here." He tapped his chest over his heart. "That's where the people we love stay. Not in buildings or places. In us." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "The warmth of the soup, the shelter from the wind, the simple human presence of another person. It was all too much." She'd been alone so long, had held herself together through sheer will. And now that someone else was here, now that she didn't have to be strong anymore, everything was threatening to fall apart. "I lost my wife 5 years ago," Hank said, his voice quiet. "Alice, cancer took her slow and mean. Watching her waste away was the hardest thing I ever done. After she was gone, I couldn't stay in our house. Every room had her in it. So I sold it, bought a smaller place out past Whiskey Creek, been living there alone ever since." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "Don't be. Point is, I understand what it's like. To lose someone and feel like you lost yourself too. To wake up every morning and wonder what the point is." He looked at her, his weathered face serious. "But Alice, she made me promise something before she died. Made me swear I wouldn't give up. Wouldn't let grief kill me like disease killed her. Said she wanted me to keep living, keep going, maybe find some happiness again if I could. Did you?" Clara asked. "Find happiness?" "Found purpose," Hank said. "Which is sometimes close enough. Got my ranch, my animals, help neighbors when they need it, pay back debts when I can." He smiled slightly. "Like riding 3 days through a blizzard to rescue a stubborn widow who once saved my life." Clara found herself smiling back, just a little. "I am stubborn. Runs in the species," Hank said. "Now finish that soup and get some sleep. Tomorrow's gonna be a long day." He pulled out blankets from his pack, thick, heavy wool that smelled of cedar and horses. He spread one on the ground for her, handed her 2 more to cover herself with. Then he settled his own bedroll near the cave entrance, positioning himself between her and the weather, between her and whatever might be out there in the dark. Clara lay down, her body aching in ways she'd almost forgotten. The ground was hard and cold, but the blankets were warm, and the soup sat heavy and good in her belly. Through the cave opening, she could see snow falling thick and steady, could hear the wind singing its ancient, lonely song. But she wasn't alone. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't alone. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, deep and dreamless and blessedly warm. Morning came grey and cold, the storm still raging outside their shelter. Clara woke slowly, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory returned. Hank's arrival, the journey, the cave. She sat up carefully, her body stiff and sore. Across the small space, Hank was already awake, heating water for coffee over the portable stove. Maud stood at the entrance, her bulk blocking most of the wind, looking philosophical about the whole situation. "Morning," Hank said, not looking up from his task. "Coffee'll be ready in a minute." Clara watched him work, noting the economy of his movements, the way his hands knew exactly what to do. This was a man comfortable in the wilderness, comfortable with solitude and hardship and making do. The coffee, when it came, was strong and bitter and wonderful. Clara cupped it in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers, breathing in the steam. Real coffee. She'd been drinking chicory and roasted grain for months, saving her last precious ounces of actual coffee for some special occasion that never came. Storm should blow through by afternoon, Hank said, studying the weather with an experienced eye. We'll wait it out, then push on. My place is another 6 hours from here, give or take. Tell me about it, Clara said. Your place. Hank settled back against the cave wall, his coffee cup cradled in his hands. Nothing fancy. 1-story ranch house, 2 bedrooms, decent kitchen. Got a barn, chicken coop, room for half a dozen cattle if I wanted, though I mostly just keep moored and a couple horses. 20 acres, good water, sheltered valley, quiet. Sounds nice? It's simple, he said. But it's warm and it's solid, and there's always plenty to eat. That's more than some folks got. Clara thought about her cabin, about the life she'd had with Thomas. It had been simple too, but it had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. I won't be a burden, she said again. I can work, help with chores, earn my keep. Hank looked at her over the rim of his cup. You weigh about 90 pounds soaking wet. You're exhausted and half-starved and probably got some frostbite we need to watch. You ain't earning anything for a good long while except rest and regular meals, but I can't just— Yes, you can, he interrupted firmly. And you will. This ain't about earning, Clara. This is about surviving, about getting you strong again. After that, we'll figure out the rest. She wanted to argue, but couldn't find the energy. Instead, she sipped her coffee and watched the storm through the cave entrance. The snow was coming down so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet. Being out in that weather would be deadly. Hank had timed their shelter perfectly. Tell me about your wife, Clara said after a while. Alice. Hank was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, she was a force of nature. Small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had more fire in her than most men twice her size. Talked fast, moved fast, always had 3 projects going at once. He smiled at the memory. Drove me crazy sometimes. I like quiet and she liked noise. But God, I loved her. How long were you married? 37 years. Met her when I was 22 and she was 19. Knew within a week I was going to marry her. Took me 6 months to convince her of it, but I wore her down eventually. His smile faded. Cancer came on quick. One day she was fine, next day she wasn't. 6 months from diagnosis to the end. Clara nodded, understanding that kind of quick devastation. Thomas's death had been similar, seemingly healthy one day, gone 3 months later. A bad cough that turned into pneumonia that turned into the end. She made me promise things, Hank continued, besides the one about not giving up. Made me promise I'd keep the house nice, that I'd eat proper meals, that I'd stay connected with folks. Who'd said she didn't want me turning into some hermit. He laughed softly. Failed pretty well at that last one. Turns out people remind you of what you lost. Easier to be alone. I know that feeling, Clara said. They sat in companionable silence, drinking their coffee, sharing the particular loneliness that comes from losing your person, your partner, your reason for getting up in the morning. She also made me promise, Hank said slowly, that if I ever got the chance to help someone the way you helped me that winter, I'd do it. Said life's too short for unpaid debts and unsaid thank yous. He looked at Clara directly. So this ain't charity and it ain't pity. It's keeping a promise to my wife and paying back a debt to you. That clear? Clara felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of pride and shame and fear. Clear, she said. The day passed slowly. Hank dozed intermittently, his body completely relaxed, clearly comfortable in harsh conditions. Clara tried to rest, but found herself watching him instead, this stranger who'd ridden through a blizzard to save her life. He was older than she'd first thought, probably closer to 70 than 60. His face was deeply weathered, creased with lines that spoke of decades in the sun and wind. His hands were scarred and gnarled, the hands of a man who'd worked hard his whole life. But there was a gentleness to him too, evident in the way he'd helped her onto Maud, in the careful way he'd monitored her eating, in the blankets he'd given her first. Around midday, Hank heated more soup, this time with actual chunks of meat and vegetables, and made her eat a full bowl. Clara's stomach cramped in protest at first, unaccustomed to so much food, but she forced herself to finish. Her body needed fuel if she was going to survive. "Used to do survey work," Hank said, seemingly picking up a conversation from earlier. "That's what I was doing when you found me. Mapping land for the railroad, marking boundaries. Did it for 20 years, all over Wyoming and Montana. Hard work, lonely work, but it paid well." He refilled her bowl without asking. "Saved enough to buy my place outright. No debts, no mortgage. Just me and the land. No children?" Clara asked. Something passed across his face, quick and painful. "One daughter, Sarah. She died when she was 23. Riding accident. I'm so sorry. Long time ago now," he said, but his voice said it was never really long ago, that grief like that lived in you forever. "Alice never got over it. Think maybe the cancer came because her heart was already broken." Clara understood. She and Thomas had wanted children desperately, had prayed and hoped and tried for years. When it became clear it wouldn't happen, they'd grieved in their own way. The emptiness of that lost future had colored everything that came after. "We wanted children, too," she said quietly. "Never happened for us." Hank nodded, acknowledging the shared pain. Different kinds of heartbreak in this world, but heartbreak all the same. The afternoon wore on, the storm showing no signs of letting up. They rationed their conversation, speaking in bursts and then falling into comfortable silence. Clara found herself grateful for Hank's quiet presence, for the fact that he didn't feel the need to fill every moment with chatter. He understood that sometimes silence was its own kind of conversation. As evening approached, the storm finally began to ease. The wind dropped from a roar to a steady whisper, and the snow thinned enough that Clara could see the landscape beyond their shelter, endless white, broken by dark shapes of rocks and stunted trees. "We'll leave at first light," Hank said, checking their supplies. "Should make my place by afternoon if we don't hit any trouble." That night Clara slept better than she had in months. The food, the warmth, the simple presence of another human being, all of it worked together to give her body permission to rest truly and deeply. When she woke in the pre-dawn darkness, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. They broke camp quickly, Hank packing with practiced efficiency while Clara folded blankets and tried to be useful. The morning was brutally cold but clear, the sky overhead a pale blue that promised better weather. Maud stood patiently while Hank saddled her and secured their supplies. Then he helped Clara mount, his hands gentle on her arm. "Ready?" he asked. Clara took a deep breath of the crystalline air. Somewhere behind them, far away now, was the cabin where she'd almost died. Somewhere ahead was an unknown future, a new life she hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. "Ready," she said. The landscape they traveled through was hauntingly beautiful in the morning light. Snow covered everything in soft, pristine white, broken only by the dark verticals of pine trees and the occasional rock outcropping. The sky was impossibly big, stretching from horizon to horizon in an arc of pale blue, deepening to azure at the edges. Their breath formed clouds in the cold air, and the only sounds were Maud's steady footfalls and the creak of saddle leather. Clara found herself noticing details she'd stopped seeing in the long isolation of her grief. The way sunlight glinted off snow crystals, making the whole world sparkle. The tracks of animals, deer, rabbit, something smaller she couldn't identify. The particular quality of winter silence, so different from summer's quiet, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Hank walked ahead with the steady, ground-eating pace of someone who'd covered long distances on foot. He didn't speak much, but occasionally he'd point out landmarks or shift their course slightly to avoid difficult terrain. Clara swayed with Maud's rhythm, grateful for the donkey's sure-footedness, grateful for the strength that was slowly returning to her body with food and rest. They stopped around midday in a small copse of pines that provided shelter from what little wind remained. Hank made a fire, a real fire, generous and warm, and heated soup while Clara sat on a log and tried to convince her frozen feet they still existed. "Not much further now," Hank said, handing her a cup. "Maybe 3 more hours." Clara sipped the soup, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "What will I do there?" she asked. "At your place?" Hank considered the question. "Whatever you want, I suppose. Rest mostly until you're stronger. After that," he shrugged. "House could use a woman's touch. Been letting things slide since Alice died. Garden needs work come spring. Could use help with the chickens if you're inclined. But none of that's required. Main thing is you'll be safe and warm and fed." "I need purpose," Clara said quietly. "I can't just exist." "I know," Hank said. "Felt the same way after Alice was gone. Like if I wasn't useful, I wasn't anything." He met her eyes. "But sometimes surviving is purpose enough. Sometimes just getting through the day is all the accomplishment you need." They sat with that truth between them. 2 people who'd both learned that surviving grief was its own full-time occupation. After they finished eating, Hank stamped out the fire and helped Clara back onto Maud. As they prepared to continue, Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out Thomas's pocket watch. She'd been carrying it since they left. Its weight a comfort against her hip, the watch was stopped at 3:47, frozen at the moment her old life ended. She looked at it now, at the delicate hands and the small numbers, at the scratches on the case from years in Thomas's pocket. He'd carried this watch every day of their marriage, checked it morning and evening, used it to time everything from cattle auctions to bread rising. Now it was stopped, and she'd kept it that way deliberately, superstitiously, as if winding it would be admitting he was really gone. But he was gone, had been gone for 2 years, and she was still here, still alive, still moving forward even when she didn't want to. Clara wound the watch carefully, feeling the mechanism catch and engage. The hands began to move again, ticking off seconds into minutes into hours. Time continuing whether she was ready or not. She slipped it back into her pocket and said nothing to Hank about what she'd done. But she felt something shift inside her, some small acceptance of forward motion. The afternoon sun was slanting low when they crested a rise, and Hank pointed ahead. "There, that's home." Clara looked and saw, nestled in a valley between snow-covered hills, a cluster of buildings. A house, barn, some smaller structures. Smoke rose from the chimney, a sign of life and warmth. The sight of it made her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't quite name. They descended slowly, Maud picking her way carefully down the slope. As they got closer, Clara could see the place more clearly. The house was simple but well-maintained, painted white with dark green trim. The barn was solid, built to withstand harsh weather. There was a chicken coop, a small paddock, a garden plot buried under snow but still visible in outline. It looked like a place where someone lived, not just existed. It looked like a home. Hank led them to the barn first, getting Maud settled with fresh hay and water before worrying about anything else. Clara dismounted on shaky legs, holding onto the saddle for support until her balance returned. The barn was warm, insulated against the cold, and smelled of hay and horses and that particular sweetness that comes from well-kept animals. "Come on," Hank said, taking her bag. "Let's get you inside." The house was everything Clara hadn't known she needed. Warm air hit her as soon as Hank opened the door. Heat from a wood stove in the corner that had been banked before they left. The front room served as kitchen and living space combined, with simple furniture and clean floors. Everything was neat but obviously lived in, a man's space but not neglected. "Your room's through here," Hank said, leading her down a short hallway. He opened a door to reveal a small bedroom with a single bed, dresser and window, looking out toward the mountains. Bathrooms across the hall. Outhouse too if you prefer, though the indoor plumbing mostly works when it ain't frozen. Clara stood in the doorway, overcome. A real bed with clean sheets. A dresser for her few possessions. Heat, safety, all of it suddenly felt like too much. "I'll get the stove going proper, make some real food," Hank continued. "You just rest. Take your time." He left her alone, and Clara moved slowly into the room. She set her canvas bag on the dresser and pulled out the wedding photograph, setting it carefully on top. Thomas smiled out at her from the silver frame, young and hopeful, and forever 34. "We made it," she whispered to the photograph. "I don't know what comes next, but we made it this far." She sat on the bed and it was soft, so soft after months of sleeping on a worn-out mattress with insufficient blankets. The temptation to lie down and never get up was almost overwhelming. But from the other room, she could hear Hank moving around, building up the fire, starting to cook, and she realized she didn't want to be alone right now. Clara stood and made her way back to the main room. Hank was at the stove, his back to her, doing something with a pot and a pan simultaneously. The room smelled of cooking meat and bread, of coffee and wood smoke and life. "Can I help?" she asked. He turned surprised. "Thought you'd rest." "I've been resting for 2 years," Clara said. "I'd rather do something." Hank studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Bread's in that box there, needs slicing. And there's butter in the cold box outside the door." They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing a meal that was simple but abundant. Fried ham, fresh bread, butter, beans that had been soaking, coffee, real food, the kind that sticks to your ribs and reminds your body what living is supposed to feel like. When they sat down to eat, Clara felt tears threaten again. The plate in front of her held more food than she'd eaten in a week back at the cabin. The warmth of the room, the smell of the meal, the simple human companionship, all of it was almost too much to process. "Go on," Hank said gently. "Eat." She did, slowly at first, and then with increasing appetite. Her body recognized nourishment and demanded more. She ate until her stomach protested, then sat back feeling fuller than she could remember. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For all of this." "For everything." Hank waved a hand dismissively. "Just paying a debt. It's more than that, and you know it." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Maybe. But even if it is, you'd have done the same. That's the kind of person you are." After dinner, they sat by the stove while darkness settled outside. Hank whittled something from a piece of wood, his knife moving with practiced ease. Clara found herself drowsing, the warmth and food and exhaustion all combining to pull her towards sleep. "You should rest," Hank said after a while. "Real rest, in a real bed." Clara nodded but didn't move immediately. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why did you really come for me?" "The truth." Hank stopped whittling and looked at her. In the firelight, his weathered face was all planes and shadows. "Because Alice made me promise," he said. "And because I know what it's like to be alone. And because—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because when you saved my life that winter, you didn't do it for reward or recognition. You did it because it was the right thing to do. I wanted to do the same, that's all." He smiled slightly. "That ain't enough?" Clara smiled back. "It's more than enough." She stood slowly, her body protesting the movement after so much sitting. "Good night, Hank." "Night, Clara." In her room, Clara changed into the nightgown she'd brought, washed her face in the basin Hank had filled with warm water, and climbed into bed. The sheets were clean and cool, the blankets heavy and warm. Through the window, she could see stars beginning to appear, sharp and bright in the winter sky. For the first time in 2 years, Clara Wynne fell asleep without fear, without cold, without hunger. She fell asleep in a place of safety, surrounded by warmth and kindness and the quiet presence of someone who understood loss. And in her sleep, she dreamed not of death but of spring. The days fell into a rhythm that Clara found both strange and comforting. She woke each morning to the smell of coffee and breakfast cooking, to the sound of Hank moving around the kitchen with quiet efficiency. At first, she moved through the house like a ghost, uncertain of her place, unsure what was allowed. But gradually, as her strength returned, she began to stake small claims on this new life. She learned where things were kept: flour in the blue canister, coffee on the second shelf, clean towels in the basket by the stove. She discovered Hank's routines and worked herself into them, without disrupting the patterns he'd established in his solitary years. She washed dishes while he dried them. She swept floors while he brought in firewood. They moved around each other, with the careful courtesy of strangers becoming acquainted. But it was more than that, Clara realized after the first week. They moved around each other with the awareness of people who both understood loss, who both knew what it was to wake up and wonder why they bothered. There was a kindness between them born not of pity, but of recognition. Her body began to recover with proper food and rest. The gaunt hollows in her cheeks filled in slightly. Her hands stopped shaking. The constant bone-deep cold that had plagued her for months finally eased. She found herself noticing things again. The way morning light fell across the kitchen table, the particular sound of wind in the pines, the absolute silence of snow falling at night. One morning, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Clara woke before Hank. She lay in bed listening to the house settle around her, feeling the warmth from the banked stove seeping through the walls. Thomas's pocket watch sat on the dresser, ticking steadily now, marking time's passage with mechanical precision. She rose and dressed, moving quietly through the cold hallway to the kitchen. The fire had burned down to coals, and she fed it carefully, adding kindling and then larger pieces of wood. By the time the flames caught properly, she had coffee brewing and was pulling ingredients for breakfast from their places. When Hank emerged from his room, he stopped short at the sight of her at the stove. "Couldn't sleep," Clara explained. "Thought I'd make myself useful." He nodded and poured coffee, settling into his chair. They ate breakfast as the sun rose, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and pink. "Storm's coming," Hank said, studying the sky through the window. "Big one, looks like. We should check the barn, make sure everything's secure." They spent the morning preparing, bringing extra hay into the barn, checking that the chickens had food and water, banking the house stove high. Clara worked alongside Hank, her body remembering the rhythms of ranch work even after 2 years of deprivation. Her muscles protested, but it felt good to be useful again, to have purpose beyond simply surviving. The storm hit that afternoon with startling force. Wind hammered the house, driving snow sideways and piling it in drifts against the barn. Clara stood at the window, watching the world disappear into white chaos, and felt not fear, but gratitude. She was inside. She was warm. She was safe. "You all right?" Hank asked from his chair. "Just thinking," Clara said, "about where I was a month ago. What would have happened if you hadn't come?" "Best not to think on that," Hank said gently. "I know. But I can't help it sometimes." She turned from the window. "I keep waiting to wake up back in that cabin. Keep thinking this is a dream." Hank set down the wood he was carving. "It's not a dream. You're here. You're safe." "That's real." Clara nodded, wanting to believe it, trying to trust that this wasn't some cruel temporary reprieve before being thrown back into the cold. The storm lasted 3 days. They were trapped in the house together, venturing out only to check on the animals. The enforced proximity could have been awkward, but instead it became oddly comfortable. They talked more, sharing stories of their lives, their losses, the things they'd learned about surviving grief. Hank told her about surveying work, about the vast, lonely spaces he'd mapped, the storms he'd weathered, the close calls he'd had. He told her about Alice, about their daughter Sarah, about the particular pain of outliving both of them. Clara told him about Thomas, about their dreams for the ranch, about the slow, grinding disappointment as those dreams died. She told him about the isolation after Thomas's death, the way neighbors stopped visiting, the creeping despair that had settled over her like snow. On the 3rd day, when the storm finally broke, they emerged into a transformed world. Snow had drifted to the roofline in places, creating strange sculptural shapes. The sun on new snow was blinding, painful to look at directly. Hank and Clara stood on the porch together, shading their eyes, surveying the work ahead. "That's a lot of digging," Clara observed. "That it is," Hank agreed. "Good thing I got help now." They worked together through the morning, clearing paths to the barn and chicken coop, making sure the animals were all right. Clara's muscles screamed in protest, but she pushed through, feeling herself growing stronger with each shovelful. By midday, they'd carved out enough space to move freely around the property. That evening, exhausted but satisfied, they sat by the stove warming their hands around coffee cups. Clara found herself studying Hank's face, noting the laugh lines around his eyes, the white stubble on his jaw. The way his hands curved around his cup with such careful gentleness, he caught her looking and raised an eyebrow. "Something on my face?" "Just thinking," Clara said, "about how strange life is, how you never know what's coming." "That's true enough," Hank agreed. "I mean, a month ago I was ready to die. Now I'm sitting here drinking coffee, and my biggest worry is whether I can lift my arms tomorrow after all that shoveling." Hank smiled. "Bodies are resilient. You'd be surprised what you can recover from given the chance." "Bodies, maybe," Clara said. "What about hearts?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Hank was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee. "I don't know," he finally said. "I loved Alice for 40 years. Even knowing she was dying, even having time to prepare. When she was gone, it felt like someone took an axe to my chest. Couldn't breathe right for months." "I know that feeling," Clara said softly. "But here's the thing," Hank continued. "The pain didn't kill me, even though sometimes I wished it would. And eventually, not quickly, but eventually, I started noticing things again. The way sunrise looks, how coffee tastes, small things, life things. And I realized Alice wouldn't want me dead inside just because she was dead. She'd want me living." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas said something similar. Near the end, told me not to bury myself with him. But you were doing exactly that," Hank said gently. "In that cabin?" "I know." Clara wiped her eyes. "I was so angry at him for leaving, for dying and leaving me alone. And I was so tired of fighting. It seemed easier to just stop." "But you didn't stop," Hank pointed out. "You kept going, even when it was hard. Even when you were starving and freezing and alone. Something in you kept fighting." Clara thought about that. Was it true? Had some part of her been fighting all along, even when she thought she'd given up? "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I was just too stubborn to quit properly." Hank laughed, a genuine warm sound that filled the room. "Well, I'm grateful for your stubbornness. Otherwise, I'd have ridden 3 days through hell for nothing." They smiled at each other, and Clara felt something shift. Not romantic, not yet, maybe not ever, but something. A connection, a recognition of shared experience and mutual respect. The knowledge that they were both survivors, both scarred, both still here, despite everything. The weeks passed and winter began its slow, reluctant release. The days grew incrementally longer. The air, while still cold, lost some of its knife-edge sharpness. Clara continued to strengthen, her body remembering what it was to be healthy, to be fed, to be warm. She took over more of the household tasks, not because Hank asked, but because she needed to contribute, needed to feel useful. She cooked meals, mended clothes, organized the small pantry with the efficiency of someone who'd once managed a ranch. She found herself humming sometimes while she worked, old songs she'd forgotten she knew. One afternoon, while Hank was out checking fence lines, Clara decided to explore the house more thoroughly. She'd been respectful of his privacy, hadn't gone snooping through rooms that weren't hers. But now, looking for a needle and thread to mend a shirt, she opened drawers and cabinets with increasing boldness. In the desk by the window, she found maps, dozens of them, carefully folded and organized. Survey maps from Hank's workdays, showing terrain and elevations and carefully marked boundaries. She studied them, tracing routes with her finger, imagining him walking those lonely miles with his instruments and notebooks. Beneath the maps was a wooden box, and inside that box was correspondence. Letters from Alice, from friends, from his daughter Sarah before she died. Clara didn't read them. That would have been too much of an invasion, but she noted their existence, these preserved pieces of his past. At the back of the drawer was another envelope, this one unsealed. Clara pulled it out and saw her own address written in an unfamiliar feminine hand. Martha Henderson's, she realized. The letter Martha had sent Hank, the one that had brought him to her door. She opened it and read, "Hank, I know it's been years since we've spoken, but I'm writing because I need help and don't know who else to ask. You remember Clara Wynne, who saved your life that winter in '05? Her husband Thomas died 2 years ago, and she's been alone ever since. The ranch failed, debts piled up, and she's too proud to ask for help. I'm sick myself and can't check on her like I should, but I heard through the Pritchards that she's in bad shape. Might not make it through the winter if someone doesn't intervene. I know it's a lot to ask after all these years, but if you could find it in your heart to check on her, I'd be grateful. She saved your life once. Maybe you could return the favor. Yours in hope, Martha Henderson. Clara folded the letter carefully and put it back. So that's how it had happened. Martha, sick and worried, reaching out to a near stranger on behalf of a friend. And Hank, reading that letter, remembering a debt from 20 years ago, mounting his donkey and riding 3 days through blizzards to save a woman he barely knew. The enormity of it struck her suddenly. He could have ignored the letter, could have told himself it wasn't his problem, that too much time had passed, that he didn't owe Clara anything. Most people would have, but Hank Mercer wasn't most people. She was still standing there, holding the letter, when she heard the door open. Hank stamped snow off his boots and called out, "Cold enough to freeze thee, Clara? You all right?" She came out of the room, still holding the letter. "I found this. I wasn't snooping, I was looking for thread, and it's all right," Hank said, taking off his coat. He saw what she was holding and nodded. "That's Martha's letter. The one that got me moving. You rode 3 days through storms because of this," Clara said. "Because a woman you barely know asked you to check on someone from 20 years ago. Well, when you put it that way, sounds kind of foolish," Hank said with a small smile. "It sounds like the best thing anyone's ever done for me," Clara said, her voice breaking. "Hank, I don't know how to thank you. I don't know what I did to deserve—" "Stop," he said gently. "You don't have to deserve basic human decency. You don't have to earn being saved. That's not how any of this works." "But I do," Clara insisted. "Have to thank you. Have to find some way to repay—" "You already did," Hank interrupted. 20 years ago, when you found a half-frozen stranger in your barn and brought him in and saved his life. You already paid whatever debt you think you owe." They stood looking at each other across the room, the weight of gratitude and obligation and something else hanging between them. "I'm glad you came," Clara said finally. "I'm glad you didn't ignore that letter." "I'm glad I'm here, so am I," Hank said. And in his eyes, Clara saw something that made her heart skip. Not desire exactly, but possibility. The suggestion that maybe life wasn't completely over for either of them. Maybe there were still good chapters left to write. That night Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the house settle, to the wind whisper around the eaves, to the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other across the valley. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd built and lost. She thought about those last terrible months alone in the cabin, about how close she'd come to simply giving up and letting the cold take her. She thought about Hank appearing in her doorway like something out of a dream, about the journey through the snow, about waking up in this place of safety. Thomas's pocket watch sat on the dresser, ticking away the seconds. Time moving forward whether she was ready or not. And maybe, just maybe, that was all right. Maybe moving forward didn't mean forgetting. Maybe accepting help didn't mean weakness. Maybe opening herself to the possibility of happiness again wasn't a betrayal of what she'd had. She got up and went to the dresser, pulled out her grandmother's quilt from where she'd carefully folded it. The wedding ring pattern was still beautiful despite years of use, the stitches still firm and true. But there was damage too, places where the fabric had worn thin, seams that had come apart, edges that were fraying. Clara carried the quilt back to bed and spread it across her lap. In the moonlight from the window, she examined the damage with careful fingers. She could repair this. It would take time and patience and careful work, but she could make it whole again. Not new, it would never be new, but mended, serviceable, still beautiful in its way, just like her, she thought. Not new, but mending, learning to be whole again. Spring came to Wyoming like a promise kept. The snow melted slowly, revealing brown grass and muddy earth, and the first brave shoots of green. Ice broke up in the creek that ran through Hank's Valley, and the water ran fast and clear and cold. Birds returned, filling the mornings with song. The air lost its bitter edge and became merely cool, then almost warm on sunny afternoons. Clara felt herself waking up alongside the land. Energy returned to her body, strength to her limbs. She took over the garden, planning what they'd plant, sketching layouts in the dirt with a stick. Hank watched her work with quiet approval, letting her make decisions, trusting her judgment. They fell into a true partnership, working the land together in ways that felt both new and familiar. Clara had experience from her years with Thomas. Hank had his own knowledge accumulated over decades of living alone. Together, they combined their skills, compensating for each other's gaps, building something that worked. The chickens became Clara's special project. She built them better nesting boxes, organized the coop with ruthless efficiency, learned each bird's personality, and gave them names. Hank teased her about it, but she could see he was pleased. Liked having someone care about the small things he'd been neglecting. Neighbors began stopping by, curious about Hank's houseguest, bringing welcome baskets and thinly veiled questions. Clara met them with quiet dignity, neither ashamed of her circumstances nor eager to share details. These were good people, she realized, just busy with their own lives, their own troubles. They hadn't abandoned her deliberately back at the cabin. They'd simply been overwhelmed by the business of surviving. One couple in particular, the Johnsons, became regular visitors. Tom Johnson and his wife Ruth were in their 50s, running a small cattle operation west of Hank's place. They'd lost a daughter to fever 3 years back and carried their grief visibly, in the lines around their eyes and the careful way they spoke of her. "You're looking well, Clara," Ruth said one afternoon, the 3 women sitting on Hank's porch shelling peas while the men checked fence line. "Better than when you first arrived," Hank told us. "I'm doing better," Clara agreed. "This place has been good for me, and you've been good for it," Ruth observed. "For Hank, too. He's been alone too long, that one. Needed someone to share the load." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "It's not like that. We're just—" "I know what you're going to say," Ruth interrupted gently. "You're just friends, just helping each other. But Clara, I've been married 30 years. I know what partnership looks like, and I see it when I look at you two. Whether you call it friendship or something else, that's what you've built." Clara thought about that after Ruth and Tom left. Partnership. Was that what this was? She and Hank worked together, ate together, sat together in companionable silence most evenings. They shared the labor and the rewards. They talked about decisions before making them. They'd learned each other's rhythms and adjusted their own to match. It was like being married, she realized, except without the physical intimacy, without the spoken commitment, without the legal and social recognition. They were partners in all but name, and increasingly, Clara found herself wondering if that was enough. She caught herself watching Hank sometimes when he didn't know she was looking. Noticed the way he moved, economical and sure. The way his hands, scarred and work-roughened, were nevertheless gentle when handling animals or mending something delicate. The way he listened when she spoke, really listened, giving her his full attention. He was a good man, a kind man. The kind of man who rode 3 days through a blizzard to save a woman he barely knew, who asked for nothing in return, who gave freely of what he had. And was she falling in love with him? The question scared her. She was 64 years old, 2 years a widow, still carrying Thomas in her heart. Love at her age seemed foolish, impossible, a betrayal of everything she'd had. But then again, Hank was 70 and widowed 5 years, and he probably thought the same thing. Maybe they were both wrong. Maybe love didn't have an age limit or a time frame for appropriate grieving. Maybe it just was or it wasn't, and trying to rationalize it away was pointless. One evening in early May, after a long day working in the garden, Clara and Hank sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was soft, carrying the scent of new growth and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and another answered. "I've been thinking," Clara said carefully. "About my old place." "The cabin." Hank turned to look at her. "What about it?" "You own it now. Have for months. What are you planning to do with it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Haven't really decided. Been more focused on getting you healthy, getting through winter. Haven't thought much past that." "I'd like to see it again," Clara said. "Now that I'm stronger, I think I need to go back just once. To say goodbye properly." Hank nodded slowly. "All right. We could ride out there next week, weather permitting. Stay overnight if needed. Make sure you have time to do what you need." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the sky fade from gold to pink to purple. "Hank," Clara said, "when we go there to the cabin, I want to talk. About things. About the future." He looked at her questioningly but didn't push. "All right. We'll talk." The decision made, Clara felt lighter somehow. She had a week to figure out what she wanted to say, what she wanted to ask for. A week to decide if she was brave enough to reach for something she'd thought was forever behind her. A week to decide if she was ready to love again. The journey back to her old cabin felt both longer and shorter than Clara remembered. Longer because she knew what waited at the end. Confrontation with her past, with the choices she'd made, with the person she'd been. Shorter because she was riding there with Hank, and his presence made everything easier. They left early on a clear morning, taking both Maud and one of Hank's horses. Clara rode the horse, a gentle mare named Penny, and felt almost comfortable in the saddle. Her body was stronger now, capable of the work and the travel. She was no longer the half-starved ghost who'd left this place in winter. The landscape was transformed by spring. Where there had been only white and brown, now there was green, new grass pushing through old. Wildflowers beginning to bloom in protected spots. Trees budding out with that particular yellow-green of new leaves. The creek was running high with snowmelt, and they had to find a shallow crossing where the horses wouldn't be swept away. As they got closer to familiar territory, Clara felt her chest tighten with emotion. She'd lived here for 30 years. Every rock, every tree, every bend in the path held memories. Thomas's voice seemed to echo in the wind, reminding her of shared jokes, of plans they'd made, of ordinary moments that had felt insignificant at the time, but now seemed precious beyond measure. They crested the final rise, and there it was, the cabin, looking small and forlorn against the vast landscape. The door hung slightly ajar, and Clara wondered if animals had gotten inside, if the place had been violated or damaged. Part of her hoped it had. Maybe that would make leaving easier. But when they dismounted and Hank pushed the door fully open, Clara saw that it was much as she'd left it. Cold and empty and sad, yes, but intact. The stove sat silent. The table held her last meager meal's dishes. The bed was rumpled from that final night's sleep. It was like stepping into a tomb. "Take your time," Hank said, staying near the door. "I'll be outside if you need me." Clara nodded and moved slowly through the single room. Everything was coated in dust now, and mice had definitely been active. But the bones of her life with Thomas were still visible. His coat still hung on the peg by the door. His good hat sat on the shelf. The books they'd read together still lined the small bookcase. She sat in what had been his chair and let herself remember. Not the hard times, not the failure and the grief, but the good years. The early days when everything was possibility. Middle years when their rhythm together felt as natural as breathing. Even those final difficult years had held moments of grace. A shared sunrise, a warm meal, the simple comfort of sleeping beside someone you loved. "I'm sorry," she said aloud to the empty room, to Thomas's ghost, to the life that had ended here. "I'm sorry I gave up at the end. Sorry I let myself get so lost I almost died." The silence offered no absolution, but Clara felt better for saying it. She stood and began gathering a few items she'd left behind. More photographs, a few books, Thomas's coat. She couldn't leave that behind. His hat. The flower canister, which still had their initials painted on it from their first year here. Small things, pieces of their life, tokens to carry forward. At the desk, Thomas's desk, where he'd done the ranch accounts and written rare letters and made plans, Clara found something that made her stop. A deed, official and legal, with her name on it. The deed to this property, signed over to her, dated 3 months before Thomas died. She'd known the ranch was failing, known there were debts. Thomas had been protecting her, making sure the land couldn't be seized to pay what he owed. He'd put everything in her name, taking the burden onto himself. Beneath the deed was a letter in Thomas's handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it, My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found what I hoped you'd never need to find. I couldn't tell you while I was alive, couldn't bear to see the worry in your eyes, but I've made arrangements. The ranch is yours, free and clear. No one can take it. I've paid what debts I could and forgiven what I couldn't. It's not much, this piece of land, but it's home. I pray you'll find happiness here, or wherever life takes you after I'm gone. Don't mourn me too long, love. I've had a good life, better than I deserved, and most of that was because of you. You gave me 30 years of joy. Whatever comes after is just bookkeeping. Find someone to share your days with if you can. Don't be alone. You weren't made for loneliness. All my love, always, Thomas. Clara read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Don't mourn me too long. Don't be alone. You weren't made for loneliness. It was like Thomas was giving her permission. More than permission, instruction. He wanted her to live, to be happy, to find companionship and purpose and maybe even love. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket, along with the deed. Then she went outside to where Hank was sitting on the porch step, whittling a piece of wood, giving her privacy and time. "Find what you needed?" he asked, not looking up from his work. "More than I expected," Clara said. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Hank, there's something I need to tell you. Something I discovered." She showed him the deed, explained about Thomas protecting her, about the letter. Hank read it silently, his weathered face unreadable. "He was a good man," Hank said finally, handing the letter back. "He was. And he wanted me to keep living, to not be alone." Clara took a deep breath. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. What comes next? What we are. What we might be." Hank set down his whittling knife and gave her his full attention. "I'm listening." "I care about you," Clara said, the words coming slowly but surely. "More than I expected to. More than I thought I could care about anyone after Thomas. You've given me my life back, not just in the physical sense, not just food and shelter. You've reminded me why living matters, why trying matters." "Clara, let me finish," she said. "I know you loved Alice. I know you're probably not looking for romance or complications. And maybe what we have now is enough. But I need you to know I'm falling in love with you. Or maybe I already have. And I don't know what to do with that." The silence stretched between them, heavy and fraught. Clara felt her heart hammering, felt the vulnerability of having said too much, exposed too much. Then Hank reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with gentle strength. "I wondered," he said quietly, "if you felt it too. That pull, that sense of something more." Clara's breath caught. "You feel it?" "Been feeling it for weeks," Hank admitted. "Tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself I was too old, that I'd had my chance at love and shouldn't be greedy. But Clara, every morning when I wake up and know you're there in my house, safe and healthy, that brings me joy. Real joy, not just contentment. And I haven't felt that since Alice died. What do we do?" Clara whispered. "I don't know," Hank said honestly. "We're 2 old fools who probably know better. We're set in our ways. We've both loved and lost, and know the pain that comes with that. Maybe it's foolish to reach for it again, but—" Clara prompted. "But," Hank continued, "maybe foolish is exactly what we need to be. Maybe playing it safe and protecting our hearts and living careful lives is a waste of whatever time we've got left." He turned to look at her fully. "I loved Alice for 40 years. That doesn't go away. But she's been gone 5 years, and I'm still here. You loved Thomas for 30 years. That doesn't go away either. But he's been gone 2 years, and you're still here. And maybe, just maybe, what we had doesn't have to end for us to have something new." Clara felt tears on her cheeks but made no move to wipe them away. I'm saying let's try," Hank said simply. "Let's see what this could be. No promises, no rush, no trying to replace what we've lost. Just 2 people who've been through hell and found each other on the other side, figuring out if there's still some living left to do." Clara nodded, unable to speak. Hank squeezed her hand. "Come on," he said, standing and pulling her gently to her feet. "Let's gather what you want to keep and head home. We've got planning to do." They worked together, loading the horses with Clara's chosen items. The coat, the hat, the photographs, the books, the flower canister with their initials. Small pieces of a life, tokens of a love, evidence that good things had existed here despite the hard end. Before they left, Clara walked through the cabin one more time. She touched the table where they'd eaten thousands of meals, the bed where they'd slept and dreamed and comforted each other through bad nights, the window where she'd watched for Thomas's return from town, from the fields, from wherever his work took him. "Thank you," she said aloud, "for all of it. The good and the bad, the joy and the sorrow. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for every day." She felt no presence, no ghostly acknowledgement, but she didn't need one. Thomas was in her heart, would always be in her heart. But her heart was big enough to hold both past love and future possibility. Outside, Hank was already mounted, holding Penny's reins. He helped Clara up, his hands steady and sure. The sun was high overhead now, warming the earth, coaxing growth from soil that had seemed dead just weeks before. They rode away from the cabin side by side, not looking back. Behind them lay the past, honored and acknowledged, but no longer defining. Ahead lay Hank's ranch, the garden they'd plant, the summer they'd work through together, the future they'd build one day at a time. Clara reached over and took Hank's hand as they rode. He squeezed it gently, and in that gesture was promise and possibility and the courage to try again. Spring in Wyoming had never looked so full of hope. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Clara had experienced. She'd been courted before. Thomas had courted her properly, with flowers and Sunday visits and careful chaperones. But this was different. She and Hank were already living together, already partners in the daily work of survival. What they were building now wasn't courtship in any traditional sense. It was something else entirely, a gentle exploration of what more might mean. It started small. Hank's hand on her shoulder as he passed her chair. Clara's fingers brushing his as they worked together, preparing meals. Sitting closer together on the porch in the evenings, their bodies touching from shoulder to hip, warm and comfortable and right. They talked more, sharing not just facts, but feelings. Hank told her about the dreams he'd had when he was young, before life and experience tempered them into something more practical. Clara shared her fears about the future, her guilt about moving forward, her wonder at finding herself here now, feeling things she thought were long dead. "Does it feel like betrayal?" she asked one evening, the question she'd been holding for weeks, finally escaping. "Loving someone else after Alice?" Hank considered the question carefully. "No," he said finally. "It feels like I'm honoring what Alice and I had by proving love is possible. That it's worth the risk, even knowing how much it can hurt. Alice would want that for me. She'd probably be happy I found you." "Thomas said something similar," Clara admitted. "In his letter, told me not to be alone, to find companionship. But knowing he wanted that and actually doing it are different things. Are you happy?" Hank asked. "Right now, in this moment?" Clara thought about it. Was she happy? The question seemed almost foreign after 2 years of grinding survival, of loneliness so profound it became a physical weight. "Yes," she said, surprised by how true it was. "I think I am." "Then that's what matters," Hank said simply. The garden they'd planned in abstract became real under their hands. They worked side by side, turning soil that winter had hardened, adding compost, creating neat rows where vegetables would grow. Clara found herself humming while she worked, old hymns and folk songs she'd learned as a child. "You've got a nice voice," Hank observed one afternoon. Clara flushed. "Haven't sung in years. Thomas always said I sounded like a rusty gate." "Thomas was wrong," Hank said. "Or maybe teasing. Either way, I like hearing it." So Clara sang more, letting the music fill the spaces between conversation, adding melody to their shared labor. And sometimes Hank would join in with his own rough baritone, and they'd harmonize imperfectly but joyfully, 2 old voices celebrating the simple fact of being alive. The Johnsons visited regularly, and Ruth's knowing looks became more pronounced as spring progressed. Other neighbors stopped by too, drawn by news that Hank had a woman living with him, curious about the arrangement. Clara met them with quiet dignity, neither apologizing for the situation nor explaining more than necessary. Let them talk, she thought. Let them wonder. At her age, At their age, conventional propriety seemed less important than genuine connection. One afternoon, while Hank was in town getting supplies, Ruth stayed behind after Tom left, clearly wanting a private conversation. "I'm going to speak plain," Ruth said as they sat on the porch with coffee, "because we're both too old for dancing around things. You're in love with him, aren't you?" Clara could have denied it, deflected, changed the subject. Instead, she said simply, "Yes, and he with you, I'd wager. He says so." "Good," Ruth nodded firmly. "You both deserve happiness. Life's too short and hard to turn away from it when it shows up." "People will talk," Clara said. "People always talk. Let them. Half of them are jealous anyway, wishing they had what you two are building." Ruth reached over and patted Clara's hand. "Don't waste time worrying about propriety, Clara. We've all seen too much death, too much loss. When you find something good, you hold on to it with both hands." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you for understanding." "I know grief," Ruth said quietly. "Know how it can swallow you if you let it. And I know that moving forward isn't forgetting. It's survival." She stood to leave. "My Sarah would have been 23 this year. Would have been married probably, maybe had children. I'll never stop missing her. But that doesn't mean I can't be happy too. They're not mutually exclusive." After Ruth left, Clara sat alone with her thoughts. Moving forward isn't forgetting. It's survival. The words echoed in her mind, giving her permission she hadn't realized she needed. That evening, when Hank returned from town, Clara met him at the door. She'd made his favorite meal, venison stew with fresh bread, and the house smelled of cooking and comfort. "Good trip?" she asked, helping him unload supplies. "Got everything we needed and then some," Hank said. "Ran into Martha Henderson in town. She sends her regards." "Martha." Clara felt a surge of gratitude. "I need to write her, thank her properly." She'd like that. Hank carried the last of the supplies inside and paused, looking around the house. "You've made this place different, you know. In a good way. It's not just my house anymore. It's home." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "It feels like home to me, too." They ate dinner together as the sun set, talking about small things, the garden's progress, Tom Johnson's new calf, the weather forecast for the coming week. Ordinary conversation, the kind that happened between people who shared a life. After dinner, instead of sitting separately as they had for so many weeks, Hank pulled his chair close to Clara's. They sat together, watching darkness fall, comfortable in the silence. "I've been thinking," Hank said eventually, "about your cabin. Your land, what about it?" "It's yours." Thomas made sure of that. "The question is what you want to do with it." Clara had been thinking about this too. "I don't want to live there again. Too many ghosts, too many memories of bad times. But I don't want to just abandon it either. What if we fixed it up?" Hank suggested. "Made it useful again. Could rent it to someone who needs a place. Or use it for seasonal help come harvest." Or, he paused. "There's another option too." "What's that?" "Turn it into something for the community. A place where people could gather, maybe get help if they need it. Like what Martha did for you, reaching out when you needed it. We could do that for others." Clara considered the idea. The cabin where she'd almost died, becoming a place of hope and help for others. It had symmetry meaning. It honored what Thomas had built while transforming the pain that had happened there. "I like that," she said slowly. "I like it very much." They sat planning, imagining how it might work, what they'd need to do. And Clara realized this was partnership in its truest sense, not just sharing labor, but sharing vision, building something together that neither could have made alone. Later, as Clara prepared for bed, she looked at the 2 photographs on her dresser. Thomas in his silver frame, forever young and hopeful, and beside it now, a new photograph, taken by Ruth on one of their visits, showing Clara and Hank standing by the garden, both smiling, both present and alive, and looking towards something beyond the camera's view. 2 loves, 2 lives, not in competition but in succession, each valuable, each real. Clara touched Thomas's photograph gently. "I hope you'd understand," she whispered. "I hope you'd be happy for me." The photograph, of course, didn't answer, but in her heart Clara felt at peace. Thomas had loved her enough to want her happy. Honoring, that meant living fully, loving deeply, taking the chances that came her way. She climbed into bed and, for the first time, let herself imagine a future. Summer working the garden with Hank, fall harvesting what they'd grown. Winter sitting by the fire, warm and fed and together. Spring planting again, the cycle continuing, and maybe, just maybe, more than that. Maybe a wedding, simple and honest. Two old people choosing each other with full knowledge of what love could cost. Maybe officially becoming partners in all ways, not just the practical ones. The thought should have scared her. Instead, it filled her with quiet joy. In the other room, she could hear Hank moving around, preparing for his own sleep. The sounds of another person in the house, the knowledge that she wasn't alone. It was the sweetest gift she could imagine. Clara closed her eyes and let herself drift towards sleep, grateful for second chances, for stubborn cowboys and patient donkeys, for neighbors who cared and friends who intervened, and for whatever force in the universe had decided she deserved to keep living. Tomorrow would bring more work, more conversations, more small steps toward whatever their future might be. But tonight, right now, in this moment, Clara Wynne was happy, and that was more than enough. The storm came without warning on an evening in late June. Clara and Hank were in the garden, pulling weeds and checking on the vegetables that were beginning to show real growth when the wind shifted suddenly. The sky, which had been clear and bright just minutes before, turned an ominous grey-green color that made Hank straighten and scan the horizon. "We need to get inside," he said urgently. "Now." They barely made it to the house before the first drops fell, huge, cold, driven by wind that bent trees and rattled windows. Within minutes, the rain became a deluge, falling so hard Clara could barely see the barn from the kitchen window. "It's not supposed to rain like this in summer," she said, watching water sheet across the yard. "No," Hank agreed, his face serious. "This is the kind of storm that floods creeks and takes out bridges. We're going to be stuck here for a bit." The storm raged through the afternoon and into evening, showing no signs of letting up. Hank checked the animals, getting soaked in the brief sprint to the barn and back. He changed into dry clothes while Clara prepared dinner, both of them moving around each other in the now familiar dance of shared space. After dinner, they sat by the fire Hank had built despite the season, needing the warmth to chase away the damp chill that had crept into the house. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, and lightning lit up the windows in intermittent flashes. "Makes me think of that blizzard," Clara said. "The one 20 years ago when you got lost in my barn. Different season, same lesson," Hank said. "Nature doesn't care about our plans. Do you remember much from that time?" Clara asked. "From when I found you?" Hank leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant with memory. "Some. I remember the cold, how it stopped hurting after a while, and that scared me more than the pain. I remember thinking I was going to die out there, that no one would find me until spring. Then I remember you, pulling me into the barn, your face so determined. You weren't very big, but you hauled me like I weighed nothing." "Adrenaline," Clara said. "And stubbornness. I couldn't just let you die. You and Thomas spent 2 days bringing me back," Hank continued, "feeding me broth, piling blankets on top of me, keeping the fire going. Thomas gave me his own clothes because mine were ice. You barely slept checking on me every few hours. We did what anyone would do, except no one else did," Hank pointed out. "I'd been wandering for days, past other ranches, other homesteads. No one saw me or helped, but you did. That's why when Martha's letter came, there was no question what I'd do. Thunder cracked directly overhead, making them both jump. The lights flickered. They'd recently gotten electricity in this part of the valley, and Clara instinctively moved closer to Hank's chair. "Storm's right on top of us," she said. "We're safe here," Hank assured her. "House is solid." "Been through worse." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm's fury. Clara found her thoughts drifting to the past few months, to everything that had changed. 5 months ago, she'd been starving and alone, waiting to die. Now she was here, safe and fed, and falling in love with a man who'd saved her life. "Hank," she said suddenly, "what are we doing?" He looked at her, eyebrows raised. "Sitting by the fire?" No, I mean, what are we doing? Us, this, she gestured between them. We've been dancing around it for weeks, taking small steps, being careful. But where are we going? Hank was quiet for a moment. Where do you want to go? I don't know, Clara admitted. Part of me wants to keep it like this, safe and simple. But another part, she stopped, gathering courage. Another part wants more, wants everything, wants to stop being careful and just live. I know that feeling, Hank said quietly. What are you afraid of? Clara asked. Really? Hank took a deep breath. That I'm too old for this. That I won't be what you need. That we'll mess up this good thing we have by wanting more. That loving you will hurt just as much as losing Alice did when, not if, but when, one of us dies. He paused. That you'll realize you don't actually want this with me, that it's just proximity and gratitude. It's not gratitude, Clara said firmly. Not anymore. Maybe at first, but now... She moved from her chair to kneel beside his, taking his weathered hand in hers. Now it's real. You're real. What I feel is real. I know, Hank said, his voice rough with emotion. Same for me. You're not Alice, and I don't want you to be. You're Clara, and I... He stopped, swallowed hard. I love you. Completely and terrifyingly and without reservation. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. I love you too. Have been trying not to, trying to keep it manageable. But I can't. I love you. Hank Mercer, they looked at each other in the flickering firelight, the storm raging outside. The world reduced to this room, this moment. This truth spoken aloud. So what do we do? Clara whispered. This, Hank said. He leaned down and kissed her, gentle and tentative at first, then deeper as she responded. It wasn't like the passionate kisses of youth. It was something better. It was the kiss of two people who knew what love could cost, and chose it anyway, who understood loss, and decided connection was worth the risk. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Both had tears on their faces. We're going to mess this up sometimes, Hank said. We're stubborn and set in our ways, and we're going to fight. Probably, Clara agreed. And one of us is going to die first. And it's going to devastate whoever's left, almost certainly. But right now, in this moment, I want to choose you, Hank said. I want to build something together. I want to fall asleep next to you and wake up knowing you're there. I want to spend whatever time we've got left together. Clara felt joy bubble up in her chest, pure and effervescent. Yes, to all of it, yes. They kissed again, less tentative now, and Clara felt something in her chest open up, like a door that had been closed for years, suddenly swinging wide. This was what it felt like to be fully alive again. Not surviving, but thriving. Not just getting through days, but actually living them. The storm continued outside, but inside they were warm and safe and together. They talked late into the night, making plans, dreaming dreams, allowing themselves to imagine a future they'd both thought was behind them. We should get married, Hank said around midnight. The words casual but his eyes serious. Are you proposing? Clara asked. I suppose I am. Not very romantically, but... He took both her hands in his. Clara Wynne, would you marry me? Would you legally and officially become my partner in this life? Clara didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely yes. They sealed it with another kiss, and Clara felt like a young woman again, giddy and hopeful and full of possibility, except better than young, because she brought all her experience and wisdom and hard-earned knowledge to this moment. She knew what she was getting into. She chose it with full awareness. They fell asleep in front of the fire, Clara curled against Hank's chest, his arms around her, both of them fully clothed and perfectly content. Outside the storm raged. Inside they had found their shelter in each other. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown through, leaving the world washed clean and green. Clara woke to find herself still wrapped in Hank's arms, his steady heartbeat under her ear. She could have stayed there forever, but the animals needed tending, the day needed starting. She extracted herself carefully, kissed Hank's temple, and moved to the kitchen to start coffee. When he emerged a few minutes later, sleepy and rumpled, she handed him a cup and smiled. Good morning. Fiancé, she said, testing the word. Good morning. Future wife, he replied, and they both laughed at how strange and wonderful it sounded. They spent the day checking for storm damage, finding only minor issues, a broken shutter, some flooding in the low corner of the garden. Nothing catastrophic. As they worked, they made plans. Simple wedding, Clara said. Just us and whoever wants to come. Nothing fancy. At the ranch, Hank suggested. Here, Clara agreed. Where we built this. Soon, Hank added. We're not getting any younger. Next month? Clara proposed. Next month, Hank confirmed, and just like that, with no more ceremony than a handshake, their future was decided. Word spread quickly through the small community. Hank and Clara were getting married. The reactions ranged from surprise to delight to knowing "I told you so's" from Ruth Johnson. Neighbors offered to help, to bring food, to make the day special. Clara wrote to Martha Henderson, telling her the news and thanking her for the letter that had saved her life and led to this unexpected happiness. Martha's response came 2 weeks later, shaky handwriting but genuine joy. I always knew you two would be good for each other. Give that stubborn cowboy a kiss from me. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation, not for elaborate ceremonies or fancy clothes, but for the practical matters of truly combining their lives. Legal documents to sign, decisions about the cabin property and how to use it for community benefit. Discussions about what combining households really meant at their age. They decided to keep it simple, a ceremony at sunset, dinner afterward with friends. No honeymoon, because where would they go that was better than here? Clara found a simple dress in town, cream-colored because white seemed presumptuous for a woman her age. She had her hair trimmed, bought new shoes, small vanities that made her feel special. Hank got a new shirt, had his one good suit cleaned, polished his boots until they shone. He was nervous, Clara realized. This tough old cowboy, who'd weathered blizzards and loneliness and loss, was nervous about marrying her. She found it endearing. The day of the wedding dawned perfect. Warm, but not hot. Clear skies, a gentle breeze. Clara woke in her room for what would be the last time. Tomorrow, she'd wake in Hank's room, their room, officially and permanently his wife. The thought filled her with joy, tinged with only the gentlest sadness. Thomas would have approved, she knew. He'd loved her enough to want her happy. This wasn't betrayal. It was honoring what they'd had, by proving love was worth pursuing again. Ruth came early to help Clara dress and do her hair. You look beautiful, she said, pinning the simple veil into place. Truly, I look old, Clara said, but without bitterness. You look happy, Ruth corrected. That's the best kind of beautiful. The ceremony was scheduled for sunset, and as the appointed hour approached, neighbors began arriving. The Johnsons, the Pritchards who'd moved back, the Hendersons, including Martha, who'd insisted on coming despite her illness. People from town who barely knew them but wanted to celebrate love whenever it appeared. They gathered in the yard, forming a loose circle. The traveling preacher from Sheridan stood ready, and Hank waited, looking uncomfortable in his suit, but smiling when he saw Clara emerge from the house. They met in the center of the circle. Two old people choosing each other under a Wyoming sky, surrounded by community and evening light. The ceremony was brief. They'd written their own vows, wanting words that matched their reality. Hank spoke first, his voice steady. Clara, I promise to be your partner in all things, to share what I have, to listen when you speak, to hold you when you need holding, and give you space when you need space. I promise to love you for however long we've got, and to make every day count. Clara's turn. Hank, I promise to build this life with you, to contribute what I can, to accept your help when I need it, to choose you every day. I promise to love you with full knowledge of what love costs, and to embrace it anyway because you're worth the risk. Simple vows, honest vows, perfect for who they were. The preacher pronounced them married, and they kissed to applause and whistles from their gathered community. Clara felt happiness so intense it was almost painful. She'd thought this part of life was over, and here it was, brand new and full of promise. The celebration afterward was everything a wedding should be. Food brought by neighbors, music from Tom Johnson's fiddle, dancing under the stars. Clara danced with Hank, both of them stiff and awkward but laughing, not caring who saw or what they looked like. She danced with other men too, Tom, the other husbands present. Hank danced with the wives. It was community in its purest form, people coming together to celebrate love and life and the stubborn refusal to give up. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Clara found herself standing with Martha Henderson, who'd stayed despite obvious exhaustion. "Thank you," Clara said, hugging her carefully. "For the letter. For reaching out. For saving my life. I just wrote words on paper," Martha said. "Hank did the saving. You both did," Clara insisted. "I won't forget it." "Be happy," Martha said simply. "That's all the thanks I need." Finally, everyone left, and it was just Clara and Hank standing in the yard of their home, married and beginning their new life together. "How are you feeling?" Hank asked. "Happy," Clara said. "Tired, a little overwhelmed. Mostly happy." "Come on," Hank said, taking her hand. "Let's go home." They walked into the house together, closed the door on the world outside. And in the privacy of their home, on their wedding night, two people who'd thought love was behind them discovered it was actually just beginning. They were gentle with each other, patient and unhurried. At their age, intimacy was less about passion and more about connection, about choosing to be vulnerable, about accepting and being accepted, about the profound gift of not being alone. Afterward, lying together in the darkness, Clara felt complete in a way she hadn't in years. Not because Hank made her whole, she'd learned she had to be whole on her own, but because together they created something neither could have built. "Alone, I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Hank replied, and outside, the stars wheeled across the Wyoming sky, marking time's passage and bearing witness to second chances. Summer melted into fall with the steady progression that marked life on the ranch. Clara, now Clara Mercer, though she was still getting used to the name, settled into married life with the same determination she'd brought to surviving her cabin's isolation. Except now, her determination was directed toward thriving, not merely existing. The garden they'd planted together yielded abundantly. Clara spent long days canning vegetables, making preserves, storing food for winter. But this time the work felt different. She wasn't hoarding supplies against desperate need. She was preparing thoughtfully, joyfully, with Hank working beside her, the two of them falling into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. They'd decided to act on their plan for her old cabin. With help from Tom Johnson and a few other neighbors, they'd spent weeks that summer repairing and improving the structure. New roof, solid door, better windows. They stocked it with basic supplies, food, blankets, firewood, and put out word through the community that it was available for anyone who needed temporary shelter. A place of last resort, Clara had explained to Ruth during one of her visits. For people like I was, too proud to ask for help, too isolated to know where to turn. "It's a beautiful thing," Ruth had said, turning your pain into someone else's hope. The first person to use it was a young widow named Sarah. The name made Clara catch her breath, with two small children. Her husband had died in a logging accident, and she'd been evicted from company housing. She'd arrived at Hank and Clara's door in late August, desperate and terrified. Having heard through the grapevine about the free cabin, Clara and Hank had welcomed her, helped her get settled, made sure she and the children had food and supplies. They didn't pry into her situation or make her feel like a charity case. They just helped the way Clara had been helped. "You can stay as long as you need," Clara had told Sarah. "Take your time, figure out your next steps." "No rush," Sarah had cried, overwhelmed by the kindness. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Clara had said. "Someone helped me when I needed it." This is just passing it forward. Watching Sarah and her children settle into the cabin, seeing life return to that place of near death, filled Clara with purpose she hadn't known she was missing. This was bigger than her and Hank. This was about community, about the web of care that held people up when they couldn't stand alone. As October arrived and leaves began to turn, Clara found herself reflecting on the year that had passed. A year ago, she'd been barely surviving, counting her remaining supplies and waiting for death. Now she was married, purposeful, contributing to something larger than herself. One evening, sitting on the porch with Hank as they watched the sun set, Clara voiced something that had been on her mind. "I'm happy," she said. "Really, truly happy. And I feel guilty about that." Hank looked at her questioningly. "I loved Thomas with everything I had," Clara continued. "And part of me feels like I'm betraying that by being this happy with someone else." "Are you?" Hank asked gently. "No," Clara admitted. "At least my head knows I'm not. But my heart still wrestles with it sometimes." Hank was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think that's natural. I feel the same way about Alice sometimes. Wonder if she'd approve, if she'd understand. But then I remember what she said, that she wanted me to keep living. And I think Thomas wanted that for you too." "He did," Clara said, thinking of his letter. "He said so explicitly. Then honor what he wanted by being happy. By living fully? By not wasting the years you've got left on guilt and second-guessing." Clara nodded, knowing he was right but still working to believe it fully. Some truths took time to sink in deep. "Besides," Hank added with a small smile, "I suspect Thomas and Alice are somewhere watching us. They're probably laughing at how long it took us to figure this out." The image made Clara smile. "You're probably right." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell. Inside the house, dinner waited. A pot roast Clara had made, one of Hank's favorites. The house was warm and full of good smells. The barn held healthy animals. The garden, while mostly harvested now, still produced late squash and root vegetables. They had everything they needed and more. Clara thought about that first night, when Hank had appeared in her cabin doorway like something out of a dream. How terrified and confused and hopeless she'd been. How close she'd come to simply giving up. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me." "For riding through that storm. For the letter, for the journey. For giving me a place to heal. For all of it." Hank reached over and took her hand. "Thank you for letting me help. For taking the risk on something new. For marrying a stubborn old cowboy who doesn't deserve you. You deserve me," Clara said firmly. "We deserve each other." And sitting there in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, Clara felt certain truth in those words. They'd both suffered, both lost, both known the particular hell of grief. And they'd both survived. More than survived. They'd found their way back to hope. Whatever time they had left, months, years, decades, if they were lucky, they'd spend it together. Building, growing, helping others, loving each other with full awareness of how precious and temporary it all was. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Inside, a timer rang, signaling dinner was ready. They stood together and went inside, closing the door against the October chill. The house welcomed them with warmth and light, a shelter against darkness, a home they'd built together from rescue and gratitude and love. And somewhere, Clara liked to think, Thomas and Alice were watching, approving, grateful that the people they'd loved had found their way back to life. Winter returned to Wyoming, but this time Clara greeted it without fear. The wood was stacked high, the pantry was full, and most importantly, she wasn't alone. She woke each morning to Hank's steady breathing beside her, to the knowledge that whatever the day brought, they'd face it together. They celebrated their first Christmas as a married couple with quiet joy. A small tree decorated with simple ornaments. A good meal shared with the Johnsons and a few other close neighbors. Gifts that were practical. New gloves for Hank. A warm shawl for Clara, but given with love. On Christmas evening, after their guests had left, Clara and Hank sat by the fire with coffee and watched snow fall outside the window. "I have something for you," Hank said, pulling a small package from his pocket. "Wasn't sure if I should give it with everyone here or wait for private." Clara unwrapped it carefully to find a small wooden bird carved with obvious care and skill. It was delicate and beautiful, its wings spread as if in flight. "You made this?" she asked. "Tried to," Hank said. "Been working on it for weeks. Alice used to carve birds. You saw the one on the mantel. I wanted to try my hand at it, make something for you." Clara felt tears well up. The gift was imperfect, the proportions slightly off, the details less refined than Alice's work. But it was made with love, made specifically for her, and that made it perfect in its own way. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "I love it." She placed it on the mantel next to Alice's bird, the two carvings side by side. "Old love and new love, past and present coexisting in harmony. I have something for you too," Clara said. She retrieved a wrapped package from where she'd hidden it behind her chair. Hank opened it to find a quilt, her grandmother's wedding ring quilt, fully repaired. Clara had spent months carefully mending the worn places, replacing torn fabric, reinforcing weak seams. It wasn't perfect. The repairs were visible if you looked closely, but it was whole again, functional again. "Beautiful again. You fixed it," Hank said, running his hands over the careful stitching. "We're all a little torn and worn," Clara said. "But that doesn't mean we can't be mended. Can't be useful and beautiful again." Hank looked at her, understanding the metaphor. "Thank you for this and for being willing to be mended alongside me." They spread the quilt across their laps, sharing its warmth, and Clara felt a contentment so deep it was almost pain. This was what she'd lost and found again. Not just love, but partnership. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just existence, but life. As winter deepened and they settled into the quiet rhythms of the season, Clara found herself thinking about legacy. What would remain after they were gone? What mark would they leave? The answer came one February morning when Sarah, the young widow they'd helped, appeared at their door with her children. "I wanted to tell you," Sarah said, her face bright with hope. "I got a job in town at the general store. They're giving me a room above the shop, enough space for me and the kids. We're going to be all right." Clara hugged her tightly. "That's wonderful news. And I wanted to ask," Sarah continued, "if someone else could use the cabin now. I heard about a family, the Martins, who lost their place. They have nowhere to go and spring is still months away." "Of course," Hank said immediately. "That's what it's there for." After Sarah left, Clara turned to Hank with shining eyes. "Do you see? It's working. People helping people, creating a chain of care." "You did that," Hank said. "We did it," Clara corrected. "Together," and that, Clara realized, was their legacy. Not just surviving their own hardships, but using those experiences to help others. Creating shelter, physical and emotional, for people who needed it. Proving that compassion and community could carry people through their darkest times. Spring came again, as it always did. The snow melted, the creek ran high, the first brave flowers pushed through the earth. Clara and Hank planted their second garden together, this time with the confidence of experience. They knew what worked, what didn't, how to maximize their small plot of earth. On a warm May afternoon, with the garden planted and the world green and growing, Clara found herself at the fence line, looking out over the valley. Hank came to stand beside her, his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About how far we've come," Clara said. "About second chances and mercy and all the small miracles that had to happen to bring us here." "You mean like a sick woman writing a letter to a stranger?" Hank said. "And that stranger deciding to ride 3 days through hell on a patient donkey." Clara laughed. "Exactly like that. You know what I think?" Hank said. "I think we're supposed to be here, doing this, helping people, being together. All of it, the hard parts and the good parts, led us exactly where we're meant to be." Clara leaned into him, feeling his solid warmth, his steady presence. "I think you're right." They stood together, watching the valley as evening approached. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear children laughing. Sarah's kids, maybe, or another family they'd helped. The sound of life continuing, of hope renewing, of the endless cycle of loss and recovery and joy. Clara thought about that first night, sitting in her cold cabin, eating her last biscuits, praying for release. She thought about Hank's knock on the door, his gruff command, "Get your things. You're coming with me." At the time, she'd thought he was just saving her life. And he had been, but he'd done so much more than that. He'd given her a reason to live, a purpose, a partner, a future, and in return, she'd given him the same things. They'd saved each other, really. Two broken people mending each other, creating something whole and beautiful from their shared pain. "I love you," Clara said. "I love you too," Hank replied. Simple words. said thousands of times by millions of people. But in that moment, in that place, with their history and their future stretching out before them, the words felt like everything. They turned together and walked back to the house, their home, their shelter in every storm. And as the sun set over Wyoming, painting the sky in gold and pink and purple, Clara Wynne Mercer felt something she'd thought she'd lost forever. She felt like she belonged, like she had a place in the world, like she was finally and fully home. And in her heart, alongside the love she still carried for Thomas, there was room for this new love, this new life, this unexpected gift of grace. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.